Scripture this evening is from Matthew 14:28 through 32. Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat, and walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind stopped.
After feeding the 5,000, the people there that day, they thought, well, this is a pretty good deal. We got a great thing here. We can get fed. This guy can feed us with hardly anything. And they were going to force Jesus to be king. Well, Jesus has no intention of being a king in the sense that they want him to be a king. And he immediately sends the disciples away in the boat onto the Sea of Galilee. And it says that Jesus, he went to a secluded place in order to be alone and to pray. Well, Mark tells us, though, that as Jesus is there in that place of praying, that he could see the disciples struggling out on the Sea of Galilee. He could see them struggling against the storm that was, or the wind that was raging on that particular day. You know, I think sometimes we do get this idea, we do get this mental picture of what is taking place in these situations, both situations, in fact, where we see a storm on the Sea of Galilee and we see lightning and rain, and yet that's really not what was going on. In fact, the Bible never intonates that. It was a wind that would come off of Mount Horeb, and it would come flowing down, and it would hit the Sea of Galilee, and it would cause a lot of large waves. And these boats were not real, they didn't sit high in the water, and so it didn't take a lot for a boat to get in trouble. And so that's really what we're seeing here is a strong wind that blows across the Sea of Galilee, causes problems with these boats, and that's what's taking place on this particular night. John tells us that they had rowed for about 3 or 4 miles, but this wind is blowing them away from the shore. Because it came from the shoreline that they left from, it's now blowing them away from the shore, so they're getting further and further out into the Sea of Galilee, and they are trying to row their way back. Somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. that night, Jesus comes to them. He comes to them walking on the water, and they are terrified, and they cried out when they saw Jesus. I think it's dark. You might have some moonlight. You might have some ability to see something, but I guarantee you that if any of us were in a boat and we saw somebody out on the surface of the water that wasn't in a boat, right? And they've never seen Jesus walk on water before, so this is a new thing. It might scare us just a little bit. And obviously they can't quite make out who it is. They can just see someone walking on the water, and they think it's a ghost. And they are terrified by what they see. And Jesus tells them to be courageous, and identifies himself to them. Well, up to this point in the story, we have seen what I have told you. There are 3 types of eyes that we see in this story of Jesus there on the Sea of Galilee. First, we see power-hungry eyes that are set on earthly power, and that's the 5,000. That's the people that Jesus fed. They want a king. They see an opportunity for power to be taken, and so they got power-hungry eyes. They want to get a hold of Jesus, make him their king, rule with him, be a part of his army that every king would have. So we see that. We see fearful eyes as the disciples are looking at the wind, looking at the waves. They have fearful eyes, and that's then multiplied when they see this figure, or they see Jesus out there walking on the water. And then we see eyes of pity. That's Jesus on the mountain, looking down on the Sea of Galilee and seeing the disciples struggle, seeing them going against this terrible wind, seeing them dealing with these waves, and he has eyes of pity on them and goes to them and begins that walk on the sea. For the remainder of the story, we see three other kinds of eyes. Peter, there in the boat, after Jesus identifies himself, tells them to be courageous, Peter, with eyes of hope, says, Lord, if it is you. You know, Peter wants it to be Jesus, clearly. I mean, he wants it to be Jesus because the other story has already happened. The time when Jesus was asleep in the boat and the storm came and they woke him up, told him they're perishing, and he calms the sea. So Peter at least has experienced, and he knows that the wind and the waves that they're dealing with, Jesus has the absolute power to deal with it. It amazed them, but yet if he could do it once, he could do it twice. And so these are eyes of hope. Lord, if it's you, he wants it to be him. And so he has a great deal of hope in his eyes. Well, those eyes of hope turn into eyes of faith. Lord, if it's you, command me to come out onto the water, to come out to you. Do you ever stop and think about the faith that took? I mean, this is a guy that's familiar with water. This is a guy that knows that he's lived every day of his life probably out on that sea at some point in every day of his adult life. And he knows he's never walked on the water any of those days, right? And we do know later on that he jumps in the water to come to Jesus. So Peter obviously had some ability maybe to swim. Maybe it was shallow. But Peter is out on a storm-tossed sea. He's far from land. And if he can't walk on the water, he's in trouble, right? Because if the storm is blowing the boat, it's going to get away from him real quick. You know, the last thing you want to do is get out of your boat in the ocean, because you'll get away from it and you can't catch up with it. The current will carry it away. And it's dark. And he's gone. The faith it took when Jesus said, come on. He tells him to do it. To take that leg and to put it over the end of that boat and to step off into that water. That's a lot of faith, folks. We criticize Peter a lot, but there's some things Peter does that deserves a great deal of praise. And at that moment, he has these great eyes of faith. But from eyes of faith, Peter takes us to our last set of eyes. And that is the distracted eyes. He gets out there on the water, he's walking on the water, and he lets his eyes get distracted, and it causes him to get in trouble. He looks around, he sees the waves he's walking amongst. He sees he sees the wind. In other words, he sees what the wind is causing. And he gets distracted. He takes his eyes off Jesus and begins to look at everything else going on around him and forgets the one that has the power, the one that commanded him, the one that's enabling him to walk on the water when he'd never walked on the water before. No one had. He takes his eyes off of Jesus and he begins to sink. I want us to finish our thoughts tonight considering the eyes of faith as we see it through Scripture. In Hebrews chapter 12 and in verse 2, the writer of Hebrews says, fixing your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. He says to fix your eyes on Jesus. Get your eyes on Him and don't take them off of Him. He is the one place we need to be looking. He is the one place that we need to be moving toward and looking toward as we go through this life. And this is what Peter needed to do. He needed that night to keep his eyes fixed on Jesus. I promise you, if he kept his eyes fixed on Jesus, he walks all the way to Him on the water. But he didn't. Back in Hebrews chapter 12, back up a verse from the point where the writer says to fix your eyes on Jesus. He tells us in verse 1, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin that so easily entangles us. See, what he's talking about there are the distractions. The things that hold us back. The things that keep us from running that race that he's talking about there. The things that made the people in the chapter before, that great cloud of witnesses, a people of great faith, made the difference was that they set aside those things and kept moving toward God in faith. They had eyes of faith. You got to lay aside those things that distract. You got to lay aside those things that entangle or prevent you from moving forward. You know, when we think about the idea of something entangling us, we're moving toward Jesus, and you can almost get this idea of ropes getting tangled up in your feet and not being able to get there, not being able to continue to go forward. And see, that's exactly what happened there on the Sea of Galilee, isn't it? The minute he took his eyes off of Jesus, he stopped going forward and started going where? Down. Started sinking. And the movement toward Jesus ceased. He needed to get rid of the distractions and get his eyes back fixed on Jesus. We can let so many things in our lives distract us. I promise you, the devil has a book that weighs 100 pounds full of the distractions that he can set in our lives, that he can put before us with relative ease. And we can so easily get our eyes looking in every direction except the direction that they need to be fixed on. We can be distracted by work. We can be distracted by busyness in general. Yeah. The world has a way of us, it's almost like many people are on a hamster wheel, right? They're running a lot, but they're not really going anywhere. They're not really accomplishing anything of any real purpose. And so busyness in general is, I think, a problem in our world today. Something that distracts us from the things that are really important. Because everything I give to something else has to be sacrificed. There's a finite amount of time, and I can't give it to everything. So we have to ask ourselves the question, when we have all these things, and all these things are calling on us to do this, do that, be a part of this, be a part of that, then we have to ask ourselves, what am I giving up to be a part of this or be a part of that? And when it comes to Jesus and His kingdom, may we never be giving that up. Because that's taking our eyes off Jesus. May we keep our eyes on Jesus, and there's nothing wrong with having things in our lives and having those things, but when they take away from our ability to move toward Jesus, then they become those things that entangle us, as the writer of Hebrews says. And they prevent us from running that race effectively. We can see that there are so many things, maybe some, when we think about those things that distract us, it can be those things that are incompatible with Christianity in general. But yet they draw our attention to them. From that evening in Jesus' life, we see that eyes focused on earthly power and acclaim will only blind us to the things we need. That's what happened with the 5,000. They were so focused on the king they wanted that they failed to see the king that God sent, to be a part of the kingdom of heaven that God came to establish. And so they were blinded because they had those power-hungry eyes. They rejected Jesus because He would not give them the earthly power they sought. Fearful eyes, like the disciples, will slowly but inexorably erode our trust in Jesus. And folks, when we talk about faith, at the heart of faith is trust. That I trust in what God is going to do. That I trust that what God says is exactly what's going to happen. The writer of Hebrews again says that without faith it is impossible to please God, for the one that comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder. See, there's the trust side of it. That I believe that if I do all the things that God says, He's going to do exactly what He says in rewarding me for those things. And so there is a trust, and yet fear will slowly erode our trust in Jesus. Because when the Israelites in the Old Testament, when they feared the nations around them and they would seek to make treaties with other nations to protect themselves, God said, why are you doing that? Why don't you just trust me? Why can't you trust that I will take care of you as a nation? See, Hezekiah did that when he absolutely had no chance of winning. The city was surrounded. The army was more than he could ever possibly handle. He went and he laid the demands by the king, King Sennacherib. He laid them before the Lord. And in that night he was delivered by God. See, if they trusted in God, but fear erodes trust. And so people go away, and the disciples, if they didn't get control of their fear, would have their trust erode. fact, the night that Jesus dies, we see that erosion as they all flee and abandon Jesus out of fear of the things that were taking place. Folks, we need eyes of hope. We need eyes of hope that lead to eyes of faith. We need Jesus' eyes of pity. We need His eyes of pity upon the storms and turmoil that we bring on our lives by the choices that we sometimes make. And we need to know and trust that when those eyes of pity look upon us, as He did upon the Sea of Galilee in that small little boat out there, that He will come to us. And that He will seek to help us. He will seek to be there to save us. You know, Jesus got into that boat. Two amazing things. And you have to look at the different accounts to see these things. John tells us part of this. Two amazing things. Jesus gets in the boat. And the minute He gets in the boat, the wind stops. There's no hush, be still, or peace, be still. There's none of that. He just gets in the boat and it quits. But not only that, the minute Jesus gets into the boat, they're where they were going. So not only does He still the storm, but He miraculously transports them to their destination. Immediately, they are there. So all that work, they've been being pushed out further and further into the Sea of Galilee, and they're having to row and row and row to try to save. But Jesus takes care of that. They're not going to have to row their way back. He just brings them back by the power of His might on that particular evening. Jesus will still our storms. And Jesus will get us to where we're trying to get to if we're looking to get to Him. He will get us home to heaven one day. He'll get us to where we need to be. All we have to do is let Him in the boat. Have those eyes of faith and long for Him to be in our life. We need to, in our lives, to defeat our fears that hold us back, tangle us sometimes. We need to hope in what Jesus Christ has done. Like Peter, there's going to be times where we need to step out of our comfort zones. Those things that are easy. Step out onto the water of faith, believing that Jesus will see us through. Even though it may be scary, even though it may be hard, we'll believe that we'll get through it because of Him. And most important, in this life, fix your eyes on Jesus. Focus on Him and Him alone. Because if you don't, just like Peter, you're going to sink. You're going to sink into lostness. But fix your eyes on Him who is the author and the finisher or the perfecter of our faith. Who died, as the writer of Hebrews goes on to say, who died for you, for the joy that lay before Him. And that joy is the joy of saving you and me. And how wonderful that is. This evening, if your eyes are not fixed on Jesus, get them there. If it is to obey the gospel and to come to Him initially, we hope and pray that you make that decision. If you're a child of God, maybe you've walked out there on the water for a bit, but you've gotten distracted. Get yourself focused again. Focus back on the one that's important. Keep moving toward Him. And know that one day He'll get you to where you want to go. And He'll still the storms that can fill our lives sometimes. Jesus takes care of us. If you need to come to Him this evening, we hope and pray that you'll let us help you as we stand, as we sing. Rise up and build in the name of